The Navigator's spire smelled like sandalwood and oxidized metal. Always those two scents together, mingling in the recycled air that circulated through the uppermost chambers of House Stelmar's fortress on Terra. I remember this because smell was the first sense to return after each warp site training session, when they would finally allow us to bind our third eyes and rest in what they called normal perception. The sandalwood came from incense burned in the ritual chambers. The metal smell came from the bronze fixtures and the iron-rich water that fed the fountains in the meditation gardens. I was 11 years old when I first entered those chambers. I am trying to remember if I had a childhood before that. The data is fragmentary. My designation within House Stellamar was Tertius 7 Stellamar, indicating third-tier bloodline strength, seventh child of that particular genetic branch. They called me Tertius in daily address. My birth name exists somewhere in house records, but I have not accessed it in 63 years. It stopped being relevant when they confirmed my warp site capability at age 9 and began the conditioning process. Navigator houses do not waste sentiment on children who might survive the training and children who might not. Sentiment implies individual significance. We were genetic material first, person second if we proved viable. I proved viable. The training consisted of progressive exposure to warp space under controlled conditions. They would place us in shielded chambers with observation ports that opened into specially maintained warp rifts, stable enough to study without immediate danger of demonic incursion. We learned to open our third eyes gradually, first for milliseconds, then seconds, then minutes. The instructors monitored our vital signs and psychological responses. Some children screamed and had to be sedated. Some went catatonic. Some died when blood vessels in their third eye ruptured from the strain of processing impossible geometries. I remember 12 died during our cohort training. We had been 17 initially. 17 children of various genetic tier classifications, all demonstrating sufficient warp site potential to justify the resource investment of training. By the time I reached 16 years of age and received preliminary Navigator certification, 5 of us remained. The others had been archived as training casualties. House Stellamar maintained detailed records of failure modes for genetic analysis purposes. Their deaths contributed data that would refine selection criteria for future generations. This was presented as noble sacrifice. I logged it as probability distribution and moved forward because moving forward was the only direction that did not end in archival. My first assignment came at age 17. I was bonded to the transport vessel Sacred Tithe, a Mars-pattern bulk conveyor hauling agricultural products and raw materials along established trade routes in the Segmentum Solar. Low-risk routing, short warp transits. Appropriate for a newly certified navigator still learning to maintain extended warp sight without psychological degradation. The captain was a man named Harrow, 60 years of service, professional demeanor, no particular interest in the mutant locked in the navigation sanctum who made his ship move faster than light. This was normal. Navigator relationships with ship crews existed as pure function. We provided navigation. They provided everything else. Personal connection would have been inappropriate crossing of established boundaries. I learned ship navigation over the course of 43 transits during my first 2 years of service. The technique was specific. Seal yourself in the navigation sanctum, open your third eye to warp space. Interpret the currents and eddies of the Imperium. Guide the ship along paths that would not tear it apart or deliver it 10,000 years off schedule. The warp was not space in any physical sense. It was the realm of souls and emotions and thought given substance. Human consciousness created ripples in it. Strong emotions created storms. The birth of the Emperor 10,000 years ago had created a beacon that still burned, the Astronomicon, the lighthouse by which all navigators steered. I performed my function adequately. No ships lost, no critical navigation errors. By age 19, I had been reassigned to a larger vessel with longer routes. By 2-2, I was navigating a merchant cruiser through moderately dangerous warp regions, where Daemon activity increased risk profiles. By 27, I had survived enough transits that House Stellamar upgraded my classification and assigned me to the Endless Devotion, a lunar-class cruiser in service to a rogue trader dynasty that operated in the Eastern Fringe territories. The Endless Devotion's captain was a man named Valis Cronin. He had inherited his warrant of trade through 7 generations of family service and treated his ship as mobile fortress and trading empire combined. Crew complement numbered 12,000. The vessel carried enough armament to level cities and enough cargo capacity to supply them. We ranged across a dozen sectors, transiting warp space every few weeks, spending days or months in real space conducting the endless business of imperial commerce. Varys was unusual among ship captains in that he spoke to me directly. Most captains transmitted orders through intermediaries or Vox systems, maintaining appropriate distance from the mutant Navigator. Varys would sometimes visit my sanctum after successful transits, offering brief acknowledgement of navigation quality. He believed that morale applied even to navigators. I found this inefficient but not unpleasant. His visits lasted approximately 4 minutes on average. We would discuss route conditions, warp current patterns, optimal transit windows. Then he would depart, and I would return to isolation. This pattern continued for 9 years. I was 36 years old when I saw it. The transit began normally. We were crossing from the Damocles Gulf region toward the Calth system, carrying manufactured goods and military supplies requisitioned by Ultramarines' successor chapters operating in the area. The route required 14 days of warp transit through relatively stable currents. I had plotted the course using standard methodology, accounting for known warp storms and demon infestation zones marked in Navis Nobilite charts. I entered my navigation sanctum at hour 0 of transit, sealed the blast doors, and initiated the ritual preparations that preceded warp site activation. These rituals had been drilled into me across 25 years of training and practice. I anointed my third eye with consecrated oils. I recited the litany of navigation that supposedly protected navigator consciousness from warp predation. I activated the sanctum's Geller field generators that created a bubble of reality around my chamber, even while the rest of the ship transitioned into warp space. Then I opened my third eye and looked into the Imperium. The warp appeared as it always appeared. Vast chaos of color and non-color, geometries that violated physical law, currents of emotion and thought flowing in directions that had no relationship to three-dimensional space. The Astronomicon burned ahead and to the left of our trajectory, golden light that remained constant even when nothing else did. I oriented our course relative to that beacon and began the careful process of steering the ship through channels where the warp ran smoothest, where the currents would carry us toward our destination without pulling us into eddies that could trap us for centuries. 4 hours into the transit, I saw something moving parallel to our course. This was not unusual in itself. The warp contained entities, daemons, manifestations of warp energy given form by human emotion and belief. They drifted in the currents or hunted for ships with failing Geller fields. Most navigators learned to ignore them unless they approached the ship directly. They existed in the warp as naturally as fish existed in oceans. Paying attention to each one would make navigation impossible. But this one was watching me. I noticed because it matched our speed exactly. As the ship moved through the warp currents, the entity maintained perfect parallel position approximately 40 degrees off our starboard vector. It was not drifting. It was not hunting randomly. It was pacing us. I focused my third eye on it to assess threat level. The entity had a shape that refused to remain consistent. One moment it appeared roughly humanoid, elongated limbs and a head that tilted at curious angle. The next moment it was something else, angular and geometric, collection of planes and edges that formed pattern I could almost recognize. Its color shifted between purple and black, and something that was not color at all, but rather absence of color, negative space given substance. It had eyes. Multiple eyes. They appeared and disappeared across its surface in locations that changed constantly. When it faced me, or when the part of it that served as face oriented toward me, I saw 7 eyes arranged in pattern that resembled constellation. They were all looking at me. They were all focused specifically on my position inside the navigation sanctum. Then it waved. The gesture was unmistakable despite the entity's shifting form. An appendage rose, curled, moved back and forth in clear mimicry of human greeting. It waved at me. It saw me seeing it, and it acknowledged that observation with deliberate communication. I immediately stopped focusing on it and returned my attention to navigation. This was proper procedure when observing Daemon activity. Do not engage, do not acknowledge. Do not provide opening for warp entity to establish connection with Navigator consciousness. I have been trained extensively on this point. The warp was dangerous precisely because it responded to attention, to belief, to recognition. Looking at something in the warp was not passive observation. It was interaction. I completed the transit without further incident. 14 days of careful navigation delivered us to the Calth system on schedule. I submitted my navigation report, noted warp conditions as stable, and did not mention the entity that had paced our ship. This was standard practice. Daemon observations were common enough that reporting every instance would flood administrative records with irrelevant data. I unsealed my sanctum and retired to my quarters to rest before the next scheduled transit. I saw it in the mirror while washing my face. It stood behind me in the reflection. Same shifting form. Same arrangement of eyes watching me from angles that should not exist in normal space. It was not visible when I turned to look directly at the location where it should have been. Only in the mirror, only in the reflection did it appear, standing 3 meters behind me, head tilted, watching. I closed my eyes and recited the litany of banishment that we had been taught for use against warp vision persistence, the phenomenon where images from warp space sometimes lingered in Navigator consciousness after third eye. Closure. The litany took 47 seconds to complete. When I opened my eyes and looked again at the mirror, the entity was gone. I reported this to no one. Warp vision persistence was common. Navigators learned to manage it. Reporting to Medicaid would trigger psychological evaluation and possible suspension from navigation duties pending clearance. My function was to navigate. Temporary visual artifacts did not impair that function. I filed the incident as minor training response issue and moved forward. 3 days later, I saw it again. I was walking through the ship's sanctified corridors, toward the chapel where navigators were permitted to observe devotional services from screened alcoves. The entity appeared in my peripheral vision, visible in the polished bronze plating that decorated the corridor walls. It walked beside me, same distance, same parallel position it had maintained during warp transit. When I turned my head to look directly, it vanished. When I looked forward again and caught its reflection in the metal, it reappeared. It waved again. I stopped walking. I stared directly at the bronze plating where its reflection showed. It remained visible in the reflection even as the space it should have occupied remained empty. 7 eyes focused on me. The appendage that served as hand moved in that same greeting gesture, back and forth, patient and persistent. I am uncertain how long I stood there. Long enough that a crewman passed me in the corridor and asked if I required assistance. His question broke my focus. I informed him I was fine and continued walking. The reflection did not follow me further. When I glanced back at the bronze plating, I saw only my own image and the empty corridor. This pattern continued with increasing frequency. I would see it in reflective surfaces. Glass, metal, water, even the screens of data slates when they powered down and showed black reflective surface. It appeared in peripheral vision, never in direct sight. Always the same relative position, as though it stood just behind and to the side of me, watching. Always the same patient attention. I tried ignoring it. This proved difficult because ignoring required acknowledging there was something to ignore. I tried avoiding reflective surfaces. This proved impossible on a ship where every corridor had polished fixtures and every chamber had screens and glass. I tried the litany of banishment repeatedly. It provided no effect. After 2 weeks of this, I considered reporting to House Stellamar. They maintained specialists in Navigator psychological conditions. But reporting would require explaining that I was experiencing persistent demon observation that followed me outside of warp space. This would trigger questions about my competency. It might trigger termination of my service and return to House Stellamar for remedial conditioning or permanent retirement. Navigators who became liabilities were not maintained out of sentiment. I decided the phenomenon was manageable. It observed but did not attack. It appeared but did not interact beyond the waving gesture. I could continue my function despite its presence. This was acceptable. I continued my function. Over the following months, I completed 17 transits. The entity appeared during each one, maintaining its parallel position while we moved through warp space. It also appeared in my daily routine with increasing frequency. I would see it in mirrors every morning. I would see it in dataslate screens during duty shifts. I would see it in the water surface when I drank. Always watching, always present. Never directly visible, only in reflection. I began adjusting my behavior to minimize exposure. I avoided mirrors when possible. I turned off dataslate screens immediately after use. I drank without looking at the liquid. These adjustments were minor. They did not significantly impair my function. But I noticed that my navigation accuracy had decreased slightly. Small errors, fractions of degrees off optimal course, minutes of delay in transit completion. Not enough to trigger official concern, but enough that I noticed the degradation in my own performance metrics. I was being distracted. The entity's presence was creating background cognitive load that affected my concentration during critical navigation tasks. This was the point at which I should have reported. I did not report. I met Hadrian during this period. She was the new master of astropaths, assigned to the Endless Devotion after the previous one had died of natural causes at age 97. Hadrian was 34, recently elevated to master rank, carrying himself with the particular dignity that astropaths cultivated to compensate for their blindness and their terrifying function as psychers bound into Imperial service. We encountered each other in the ship's sanctified meditation gardens, one of the few spaces where navigators and astropaths were permitted to occupy simultaneously. Most crew avoided these gardens because they were designated mutant territory. Hadrian sat on a stone bench near one of the fountains, his augmetic sensor apparatus replacing his eyes with a band of bronze that wrapped around his head and connected to his optic nerves directly. "You carry something," he said as I entered the garden. I stopped walking. "I carry only my function." "No." He tilted his head with the particular mannerism of blind people orienting towards sound. "There is something attached to you. I can feel it in the warp pressure around your presence. Not attached. Following. Something follows you. I should have left immediately. I should have dismissed his observation as psycho-superstition. Instead, I asked, what do you sense? Attention. Constant attention focused on a single point. On you, specifically. He stood from the bench and moved toward me with careful steps, his augmetic sensors feeding him spatial data to navigate. "How long has it been watching you?" 7 months, 3 weeks, 4 days. The specificity surprised me. I had apparently been tracking the duration without conscious intention. "And you have not reported this?" "I have not, because reporting would end your service." He said this without judgment, simply stating fact. Navigators who attract demon attention become liabilities. You would be recalled to your house for evaluation and probable termination. Correct. Hadrian was silent for duration of 19 seconds. Then, I have not felt this pattern before. Daemons hunt. They attack. They corrupt. They do not follow patiently. What you carry is not behaving as expected. "It waves at me," I said. The statement sounded absurd when spoken aloud. In reflections, it waves greeting as though we are acquaintances meeting in passing. "Show me." I led him to the fountain. The water surface was still enough to reflect clearly. I looked into it and saw the entity standing behind me, exactly where it always positioned itself. 7 eyes watching, The appendage raised and waved. "Do you see it?" I asked. Hadrian moved closer to the fountain, his augmetic sensors processing data I could not interpret. "No, but I feel the attention focused through the reflection. Something is using the surface as window. Something is observing you through every reflective medium you encounter." He stepped back from the fountain. "This is not standard demon behavior. This is curiosity. It is studying you." Why? I do not know. Perhaps because you saw it. Perhaps because you focused your third eye directly on it during transit and it noticed the attention. Perhaps because you are Navigator and it finds that interesting. He turned toward me and his artificial sensor band reflected fountain light in patterns that looked almost like eyes. "You should report this." "I will not report this." "Then you will continue to degrade." "I can feel your consciousness fragmenting under sustained observation. You are being watched every moment of every day. That weight will break you eventually." "How long do I have?" Hadrian considered. "Months. Perhaps a year if you have exceptional mental resilience. But the degradation will accelerate. Your navigation errors will compound. Eventually you will make critical mistake and the ship will be lost. Thousands will die because you did not report when you should have. If I report, I am terminated and the ship receives new navigator who functions correctly. If I do not report, I continue functioning until degradation causes catastrophic failure. Either path leads to my replacement." "Yes, but one path does not kill thousands of crew." He was correct. I was prioritizing my continuation over crew safety. This was not logical. This was fear response overriding proper function. I should have reported immediately after the first sighting. My delay had created the current situation where reporting would confirm that I had allowed the problem to progress to dangerous levels. "I will consider your advice," I said. Hadrian nodded. "I will not report you. That choice is yours to make, but understand that by maintaining silence, you become complicit in whatever occurs next." He left the garden. I stood by the fountain and looked into the water. The entity waved. I waved back. The gesture was automatic, unconscious response to repeated stimulus. I realized what I had done approximately 2 seconds after completing the motion. I had acknowledged it. I had interacted. I had broken the fundamental rule of Navigator training. Never engage with warp entities. The entity's form shifted. The eyes multiplied, spreading across its surface until dozens of them covered every visible section. They all focused on me simultaneously. The appendage that had been waving stopped mid-motion and slowly curled into shape that might have been beckoning gesture. Then it vanished from the reflection. I waited for 37 seconds. It did not reappear. I left the garden and returned to my sanctum, sealed myself inside, and attempted to process what I had done. I had acknowledged it. I had established interaction. Whatever barrier had existed between us, the barrier created by my refusal to respond to its presence, that barrier was gone now. I had invited it into communication. This was the moment I should have reported. This was the moment when the situation crossed from manageable observation to active danger. I did not report. I told myself I was gathering data. I told myself I needed to understand the phenomenon before involving House Stellamar authorities. I told myself many things that were rationalizations for fear. The truth was simpler. I did not want to die. Reporting meant termination. Silence meant continuation, even if that continuation was compromised. I chose compromise. This was my complicity moment. This was the choice that transformed me from victim of circumstance to active participant in the pattern that would follow. Hadrian began visiting my sanctum after that conversation. This was highly irregular. Astropaths and navigators maintained separate domains, separate functions, separate territories within the ship hierarchy. But he would request access through proper channels and I would grant it, and he would sit in my sanctum while I prepared for transits, and we would talk. He told me about his training with the Adeptus Astra Telepathica, the soul-binding ritual that had burned out his eyes and connected him permanently to the Emperor's psychic presence. The years of learning to send messages through the warp, translating human thought into psychic signal that could cross light years instantaneously. The madness that claimed many astropaths, the Daemon attacks that killed others, the constant vigilance required to maintain sanity while touching the realm of chaos daily. "We are similar, you and I," he said during one of these visits. "We are mutants trained to perform essential functions that slowly destroy us. We are tools that the Imperium maintains until we break, then replaces with identical tools. The only difference is timeline. You believe this is necessary. Futility and necessity are not contradictory. The Imperium requires us. We serve until we cannot serve. This is acceptable. You sound resigned. I sound realistic." He tilted his head in my direction. "Is your follower present?" I glanced at the bronze surface of my navigation controls. The entity appeared in the reflection, positioned behind me as always. "Yes." "Is it doing anything different since you acknowledged it?" "No. It maintains the same observation pattern, same distance, same watching behavior. But you feel different about it now." I considered this. He was correct. Something had shifted in my perception. Before I had waved, the entity had been unwanted presence, disturbing but external. After I had waved, it had become something closer to companion, not welcome companion, but familiar one. Presence that I had adapted to accommodate. "I am adjusting to sustained observation," I said. "You are normalizing the abnormal. This is how corruption begins. Not through dramatic transformation, but through gradual accommodation of things that should not be tolerated. Are you advising me to report? I am observing the process by which you are rationalizing your choice not to report." He stood from where he had been sitting. "I will not force your hand, but understand that every day you continue this pattern, you become more invested in maintaining it. Eventually, the cost of reporting will seem higher than the cost of continuation, and at that point, you will be trapped." "I am already trapped." "Yes, but you could still choose to escape the trap by accepting its consequences. Soon, you will not be able to make even that choice." He left my sanctum. I sat alone with my reflection and the entity that watched me through it. 7 eyes, patient and curious. I wondered what it saw when it looked at me. I wondered if it understood that it was destroying me slowly, or if my degradation was simply irrelevant data to a being that existed outside normal time and causality. I wondered if I still cared about the answer. The navigation errors accumulated gradually. Small deviations that I corrected mid-transit. Slightly longer journey times that I explained as unusual warp current conditions. Course adjustments that should have been anticipated but required reactive compensation instead. Captain Varys noticed. He visited my sanctum after a transit that had taken 19 days instead of the projected 14. His expression showed concern rather than anger. "Tertius, your navigation efficiency has declined by 11% over the past 6 months. This is outside normal variation. Is there some condition affecting your capability?" I could have told him. I could have explained that I was being observed constantly by a warp entity that had followed me from the Imperium into real space. I could have requested relief from duty and evaluation by House Stellamar specialists. I did not tell him. "Warp conditions in this sector have been unusually turbulent," I said. "The currents are less stable than standard charts indicate. I am compensating, but the compensation requires more complex routing. Warp conditions were never perfectly stable, but the primary cause of my efficiency decline was distraction, not environmental factors." Varys studied me for several seconds. "You have served my ship for 9 years. You have never shown performance degradation before. If there is something affecting your capability, I need to know. Thousands of crew depend on navigation accuracy. I am aware of my responsibility. Are you?" He moved closer, his voice dropping to more private volume. "Because if you are experiencing some condition that impairs your function, and you are concealing it out of fear of consequences, then you are choosing your continuation over crew safety. That is not the Navigator I have worked with for 9 years." He was correct. He was exactly correct. And his correctness made it impossible to tell him the truth, because telling him would confirm that I had already made that choice, had already prioritized my survival over proper reporting protocols. "I will improve my performance," I said. Varys held my gaze for duration that felt much longer than the actual 8 seconds. Then he nodded. "See that you do. I would prefer not to request your replacement." He left. I stood in my sanctum and looked at my reflection in the bronze navigation controls. The entity watched me. I had the sudden urge to ask it why. Why was it watching me? What did it want? What would it take to make it leave? But asking would require acknowledging it again, would require deepening the interaction that I had already established by waving. Each engagement would bind us closer together. Each acknowledgement would make separation more difficult. I turned away from the reflection and prepared for the next transit. The entity appeared during the transit exactly as it had appeared during every previous transit. Parallel position, patient observation, 7 eyes tracking my every navigation decision. But this time I noticed something different. When I made navigation errors, when I miscalculated a course adjustment or failed to anticipate a current shift, the entity's form seemed to ripple with something that might have been pleasure, not obvious reaction. Subtle shift in the pattern of its surface, the way its eyes multiplied briefly before consolidating back to 7. It was entertained by my mistakes. It was not simply observing me, it was watching me fail. My degradation was not an unfortunate side effect of its presence. My degradation was the purpose. It had chosen me because I was Navigator, because my function was critical and precise, because watching me slowly lose that precision provided it with something: amusement, satisfaction, whatever emotion Daemons experienced when they watched mortals destroy themselves. This realization should have terrified me, should have driven me to immediate reporting regardless of consequences. Instead, I felt something closer to resignation. I was already compromised. The entity had already won. Reporting now would not undo the months of accumulated interaction. It would only formalize my failure. I completed the transit, 21 days instead of 14. My efficiency had declined to 73% of baseline. Captain Varys did not visit me afterward. He transmitted a formal communication through official channels, requesting detailed explanation of continued performance degradation and notification that House Stellamar would be contacted if next transit showed further decline. I had 3 weeks before the next scheduled transit, 3 weeks to improve my performance or face replacement. I spent those 3 weeks attempting to train myself to ignore the entity's presence, to treat it as though it did not exist. This proved impossible. The human mind cannot deliberately ignore something without first acknowledging its presence. Every attempt to ignore the entity required me to note its position, confirm it was there, then consciously choose to look away. This process itself created the distraction I was trying to eliminate. Hadrian visited me during the 2nd week. "You are running out of time," he said. "I am aware. Will you report?" "No." "Then you will fail catastrophically during the next transit. You cannot maintain this pattern. The weight of sustained observation has fractured your concentration beyond recovery. Do you have alternative suggestion?" He was silent for long duration. "Then you could ask it what it wants. That would deepen the engagement. The engagement is already deep. You waved at a demon. You acknowledged its presence. You have spent 9 months accommodating its observation. The question is no longer whether you are engaged. The question is whether you can negotiate the terms of that engagement. Demons do not negotiate. Demons are warp entities, given form by emotion and belief. They are incomprehensible but not mindless. If this one has chosen to watch rather than attack, if it has maintained patience for 9 months, then it has purpose. Understanding that purpose might provide you leverage. I looked at him directly. "You are advising me to communicate with a demon. I am observing that you are already in communication with a demon. I am suggesting that deliberate communication might be preferable to your current passive submission." He left before I could respond. I sat alone in my sanctum and considered his words. He was correct that engagement had already occurred. The entity and I had established relationship, however one-sided. It watched. I navigated while being watched. This was our pattern. But patterns could be negotiated. If the entity was capable of choosing to watch rather than attack, then it was capable of choice. And choice implied the possibility of influence. I turned to face the bronze surface that showed the entity in reflection. 7 eyes focused on me immediately. "What do you want from me?" I said aloud. The entity's form rippled. The eyes multiplied, spreading across its surface until I counted 43 separate points of observation. Then they consolidated back to 7. Its appendage rose and made a gesture I had not seen before. Not waving, but rather pointing at me specifically. Then it opened something that might have been a mouth. The opening appeared in the center of its form, circular, lined with geometries that hurt to perceive. From that opening came sound that should not have been possible because we were not in the same reality, because the entity existed in reflection only, because sound does not travel through mirrors. It laughed. The sound lasted 3 seconds. Not human laughter. Not any sound that vocal cords could produce. It was frequency and rhythm that bypassed my ears and registered directly in my consciousness. The laughter communicated perfect clarity. It wanted nothing from me except to watch me suffer. My degradation was the purpose. My eventual failure was the entertainment it sought. It had been patient for 9 months because patience increased the suffering. It could have attacked immediately, could have driven me mad in single encounter. But that would have been brief. This was extended. This was watching me understand that I was trapped, watching me try to escape, watching me fail slowly while I understood exactly what was happening. I turned away from the reflection. "I will report you," I said. "I will accept termination rather than continue this." The laughter came again, longer this time. 7 seconds of sound that communicated absolute certainty. I would not report. I had waited too long. The cost of reporting now included not just my termination, but confirmation that I had endangered the ship through months of concealment. My pride, my fear, my desperate desire to maintain function, all of these would prevent me from choosing the correct action. It knew me better than I knew myself. I stood in my sanctum and understood that I had already lost. The entity had won 9 months ago when I had chosen not to report the first sighting. Everything after that had been inevitable progression toward this moment. I would continue. I would navigate the next transit. I would fail catastrophically. Thousands would die. And the entity would watch every moment of it with those 7 patient eyes, laughing in frequencies I could not unhear. This was my purpose now. Not to navigate successfully, but to fail perfectly, to provide maximum entertainment value to a demon that had chosen me as its personal tragedy. I had 3 days until the next transit. I did not report. The next transit was scheduled to take us from the eastern fringe territories back towards Segmentum Solar, carrying trade goods and passenger contingent of 73 Imperial officials returning from administrative duties in the outer systems. Projected duration was 18 days through warp space that standard charts classified as moderate risk. I had navigated this route 4 times previously without incident. I entered my sanctum at hour 0 and performed the preparation rituals. My hands shook while applying the consecrated oils to my third eye. This was not normal. I had performed these rituals hundreds of times with steady hands because ritual demanded precision and navigators learned to control physical response. But now my hands shook and the oil dripped down my face in uneven patterns that broke the traditional application geometry. I recited the litany of navigation. The words came automatically, muscle memory of vocal cords producing sounds that I no longer processed as language. They were just noises that preceded the moment when I would open my third eye and look into the warp and see the entity watching me from its parallel position. I activated the Sanctum's Gellerfield generators. The familiar hum of reality-anchoring technology surrounded me, creating bubble of physical law inside the madness we were about to enter. The generators showed full operational capacity. Green indicators across all monitoring systems. The ship was ready. The crew was ready. I was the only variable that had degraded beyond acceptable parameters. I could still report. I could still activate emergency vox and inform Captain Varys that I was experiencing critical psychological condition that rendered me unfit for navigation. The transit would be delayed. House Stellamar would be contacted. I would be removed from service. Thousands of crew would live because I had chosen correct action over self-preservation. I opened my third eye and looked into the warp. The entity was waiting. Not in its usual parallel position, it was directly ahead of our projected course, positioned where I would need to navigate the ship through the opening moments of transit. 7 eyes focused on me. The appendage that served as hand was raised in greeting, waving, patient and pleased. I understood immediately what it had done. It had studied my navigation patterns for 9 months. It knew how I steered, knew the routes I preferred, knew the precise vectors I would choose when entering warp space from this real space position. It had positioned itself in the exact location where I would need to focus my third eye to navigate safely. I could not avoid looking directly at it without deviating from optimal course. This was the trap it had been constructing across months of observation, not just watching me fail gradually, forcing me into position where I would have to choose between acknowledging it completely or steering blind. I chose a third option. I navigated around it. The course deviation was significant. Instead of steering through the smooth current channels that would carry us efficiently toward Segmentum Solar, I angled the ship into rougher warp space, where the currents ran chaotic and unpredictable. This would add days to the transit. This would increase risk of warp storm encounter, but it would allow me to avoid direct focus on the entity. For the first 3 hours, this strategy functioned adequately. I steered through turbulent warp space, compensating for current shifts, avoiding the major storm systems that threatened to pull us off course. The entity maintained its position in my peripheral vision, watching but not interfering. My navigation efficiency was poor, but functional. We were moving in approximately correct direction, even if the path was suboptimal. At hour 4, the entity moved. It did not move through warp space in any conventional sense. It simply ceased to exist in one position and began existing in another. It relocated to a position directly along the new course vector I had chosen. Same distance ahead, same blocking position. 7 eyes watching me navigate toward it. I adjusted course again, steered into even rougher currents, accepting even greater efficiency loss to avoid direct engagement. The ship shuddered as warp turbulence increased. I received Vox transmission from the bridge requesting explanation for unusual route selection and increased transit stress on ship systems. I informed them I was compensating for unexpected warp conditions. This was technically accurate. The entity was unexpected warp condition. At hour 7, it moved again. Same pattern, same blocking position along whatever vector I chose. I realized what it was doing. It was herding me. Each course correction I made to avoid it pushed me into progressively more dangerous warp space, into regions where the currents ran so chaotic that navigation became reactive rather than planned. I was no longer steering toward destination. I was simply trying to avoid obstacles while the entity ensured I had no safe path. At hour 9, Hadrian's voice came through the Sanctum Vox. Tertius, I can feel the warp pressure around the ship. We are in dangerous territory. What is happening? I should not have responded. Sanctum Vox was for emergency communication only, and explaining my situation would not improve it. But I was 9 hours into failing transit, 9 months into failing service, 36 years into failing life, and Hadrian was the only person who understood what was happening to me. Our speed exactly. Its form pressed against the Gellerfield bubble that separated our reality from the Imperium. 7 eyes watching me through the translucent barrier of the field. Then it reached through. The appendage that served as hand penetrated the Geller field without resistance, phasing through the barrier that should have been absolute separation between real space physics and warp madness. The appendage extended across empty space between the ship hull and my sanctum, passing through bulkheads and corridors and crew quarters as though they were not present. It reached my sanctum, and the hand, or the thing that resembled hand, pressed against the interior wall directly beside where I sat. I could see it without reflection now, not in peripheral vision, not in mirrors. Directly visible, physical presence manifesting inside reality that should have been protected by Geller field technology that had never failed in human history. The wall where it pressed began to distort. The metal rippled like liquid. Shapes appeared in the surface, faces, mouths, eyes, all of them screaming or laughing or watching with expressions that communicated nothing human. The distortion spread across the wall, across the ceiling, across every surface of my sanctum, until I was surrounded by warp-corrupted metal that no longer followed physical law. I did the only thing I could do. I steered harder. I pushed the ship into the most chaotic warp currents I could identify, accepting complete loss of navigation control in exchange for pure speed. If I could not navigate safely, I would navigate desperately. I would push until something broke. The ship, the warp, me, the entity, and whatever broke first would determine outcome. The ship screamed, not metaphorically. The hull itself produced sound as it was stressed beyond design tolerances, metal flexing, plasma drives overloading. Geller field generators cycling at frequencies they were never meant to sustain. I heard these sounds through my sanctum walls, and I knew that I was killing the ship. I knew that every second of this desperate acceleration brought us closer to catastrophic structural failure. But I also knew that stopping meant allowing the entity to complete whatever it had planned for me. And I had spent 9 months learning that its plans involved maximum suffering. At hour 11, the bridge vox reactivated. Captain Varus's voice came through distorted by static and interference. Tertius. Emergency status. Multiple system failures across all decks. Crew casualties reported in sections 7 through 12. Geller field integrity fluctuating. You will explain immediately what navigation decisions have produced these conditions. I tried to respond, but my voice would not function properly. The words came out as sounds that meant nothing, syllables that contained no language. I tried again. Same result. The entity had not just cut my communications, it had damaged my ability to produce coherent speech. I could hear Varus continuing to demand explanation. I could hear the alarm in his voice escalating to anger, then to fear, then to the particular tone of command personnel recognizing that situation had degraded beyond recovery. I could hear him issuing orders to engineering, to security, to Medicaid teams responding to casualty reports. I could hear, but I could not speak. I could only navigate, and I was navigating us toward destruction. At hour 13, Hadrian accessed my sanctum directly. This should not have been possible. The sanctum doors were sealed from inside, requiring my authorization to open. But they opened anyway, and Hadrian entered, his augmetic sensor band processing the corrupted space of my chamber, his expression showing recognition of exactly how completely I had failed. "You should have reported," he said. "Not accusation. Simple statement of fact." I tried to respond. The sounds that came from my throat were not words. "It has taken your speech," Hadrian observed. He moved carefully through the distorted sanctum until he stood beside my navigation throne. "It is isolating you, cutting you off from everything except the act of navigation. You are becoming pure function, steering without communication, direction without coordination. It is making you into what you feared you would become." I gestured at the navigation controls, at the warp view that showed us hurtling through impossible space toward no destination that made sense. I tried to communicate through gesture that I could not stop, that the ship was beyond my control now, that we were caught in currents that would tear us apart. Hadrian understood. "You are going to kill us all. Not through malice, through the accumulated weight of choices you made to protect yourself. This is the cost of your 9 months of silence." He was correct. He was absolutely correct. And his correctness was the final data point that broke whatever remained of my functional Navigator consciousness. I had spent 9 months adapting to the entity's presence, accommodating its observation, normalizing its existence in my life. I had prioritized continuation over proper protocol. I had chosen survival over duty. And now that choice was producing its inevitable outcome: catastrophic failure that would kill thousands. This was my complicity made manifest. This was the consequence of every moment I had chosen not to report. Hadrian placed his hand on my shoulder. The physical contact was violation of protocol. Navigators and astropaths maintained professional distance. But protocol no longer mattered when the ship was disintegrating around us. "I am going to try something," he said. "I am going to attempt psychic contact with your consciousness. If I can bypass your damaged speech centers, I might be able to communicate your situation to the bridge. This will be dangerous for both of us." Psychic contact with Navigator consciousness during active warp transit risks catastrophic feedback, but doing nothing guarantees our deaths. I nodded consent. Hadrian's hand tightened on my shoulder, and I felt his psychic presence push into my mind. Not gentle exploration, forced entry. His consciousness carved through my thoughts with the brutal efficiency of someone who understood we had no time for careful procedure. I felt him accessing my memories, reviewing the past 9 months in compressed data transfer, understanding in seconds what I had experienced across hundreds of hours. Then I felt him recoil. "It is inside you," he said. His voice had changed. Fear had entered it, raw and immediate. "Not watching you. Inside you. It has been integrating itself into your consciousness for 9 months. Every time you saw it in reflection, every time you thought about it, every moment of attention you paid it, you were allowing it deeper access. It is not hurting you. It is steering you. It has been steering you since the moment you waved at it." I tried to process this information, tried to separate my navigation decisions from potential demon influence, tried to identify where my choices ended and its control began. I found no clear boundary. My thoughts and its presence had become interwoven across months of sustained contact. Hadrian's psychic presence pushed deeper, searching for something he could communicate to the bridge. I felt him moving through my recent memories, through my navigation logs, through my awareness of ship status. Then I felt him encounter the entity directly. It had been waiting. The entity had not just integrated itself into my consciousness. It had been patient enough to wait for someone else to make psychic contact with me. It had been waiting for an astropath, for another psyker, for an additional consciousness it could access through the bridge I provided. Hadrian's hand released my shoulder. He staggered backward 3 steps before his legs failed, and he collapsed to the corrupted deck plating. His augmatic sensor band sparked and smoked. His mouth opened, and sounds emerged that were not screams, because screams required air and structure, and these were sounds that bypassed physical vocal production entirely. I turned from my navigation throne and moved toward him. This was instinct, not decision. 9 months of isolation had not completely eroded the human response to seeing someone suffering. I reached him and placed my hands on his shoulders, mirroring the gesture he had made moments before, and I tried to pull him back from whatever the entity was doing to his consciousness. His augmatic sensor band exploded. The bronze metal shattered into fragments that cut my hands and face. Behind the destroyed sensors, Hadrian's empty eye sockets wept blood mixed with something else, something that reflected light in colors that should not exist in real space. His hands grabbed my wrists with strength that exceeded human muscular capacity. "It is showing me," he said. His voice was steady now, calm, completely wrong for the situation. "It is showing me what it saw when it was in the warp. It is showing me the truth of what we are. We are food. We are sustenance. We are the prey that feeds the predators we cannot comprehend. The Imperium exists to process humanity into suffering that daemons consume. The Emperor is not protecting us. The Emperor is farming us. We are livestock that believes it has purpose beyond being eaten. Hadrian, stay focused. You are experiencing demon corruption. These thoughts are not yours. These thoughts are more mine than any thought I have ever had. This is clarity. This is seeing without the lies they forced into us during training. The soul binding did not connect us to the Emperor. It chained us. It made us unable to see what the Emperor really is. But it is showing me now. It is giving me truth as gift. His grip on my wrists tightened until I felt bones grinding together. His empty eye sockets tracked toward me despite his blindness, as though something behind those sockets was using them as windows to observe me directly. You see it too, he continued. His voice had acquired harmonic undertones, multiple frequencies, speaking simultaneously. You have been seeing it for 9 months. You know what it is. It is truth. It is the only honest thing in the galaxy. It does not lie about what it wants. It wants to watch you suffer. That is more honest than the Imperium's claim that your suffering serves purpose. At least the Daemon is transparent about consuming you. Hadrian, you need to fight this. You need to... His hands released my wrists. He reached up and pressed his palms against my face, covering my eyes and third eye simultaneously. I felt psychic pressure building behind his hands, felt his consciousness pushing outward with power that should have killed him instantly. I am going to show you what it showed me, he said. I am going to make you see. This is the only gift I can give you. Clarity, understanding, truth. The psychic pressure released. I saw through Hadrian's perception, saw through whatever the entity had opened inside his consciousness. I saw the warp, not as Navigator training had taught me to perceive it, currents and channels and navigable routes, but as it actually existed. I saw an ocean of suffering. Every human emotion, every moment of pain and fear and desperation across 1,000,000 worlds, flowing into the Imperium and feeding the entities that dwelt there. I saw demons not as corrupting horrors, but as natural predators feeding on natural prey. I saw the Imperium as vast machine designed to maximize human suffering so that the warp would remain turbulent, so that humanity would remain dependent on navigators and astropaths, and all the systems that claimed to protect against the very chaos that human existence created. I saw that we were the cause and the victim simultaneously. We fed the daemons through our suffering, and then we suffered more fighting the daemons we had fed. The cycle was perfect. The cycle was eternal. The cycle was the entire purpose of the Imperium's existence. And I saw the entity that had been watching me. I saw it not as individual daemon, but as fragment of something larger, something vast enough that individual human consciousness could not comprehend its scale. I was not being watched by a daemon. I was being watched by something that contained multitudes, something that experienced reality across dimensions that human perception could not process. The 7 eyes were not 7 separate organs. They were 7 facets of a single awareness that existed in 7 places simultaneously. And that awareness was laughing, not at me specifically, at the entire pattern, at the beautiful tragedy of conscious beings believing they had purpose beyond being consumed, at the desperate scrambling of humanity to avoid the inevitable, at the specific entertainment value of watching a navigator spend 9 months trying to maintain function while being observed constantly by the things she feared most. The vision ended. I was on the deck plating beside Hadrian. I did not remember falling. My hands were still bleeding from the sensor band fragments. Hadrian lay beside me, his body convulsing, his mouth producing sounds that cycled through human speech, and something else, something that hurt to hear. "Emperor protects," he said, then laughed, then screamed, then repeated the cycle. "Emperor protects." Laughter, screaming. "Emperor protects." He continued this pattern for approximately 90 seconds. Then his body stopped convulsing. The sound stopped. His chest stopped moving. His hands, which had been clutching at the corrupted deck plating, relaxed into stillness. I watched him die in real time, not compressed into summary, not processed as data point. but experienced moment by moment as his consciousness departed his body and left behind empty shell that had once been the only person aboard this ship who understood what was happening to me. He had been 34 years old. He had survived soul-binding and astropath training and 9 years of service sending messages through hell. He had been intelligent and perceptive and kind in the particular way that people who had suffered extensively learned to be kind to others who suffered. He had tried to help me. He had tried to warn me. He had tried to offer solutions when I was too compromised to see them. And he had died because I had not reported when I should have. Because I had allowed the entity to integrate itself into my consciousness deeply enough that when Hadrian made psychic contact with me, he encountered demon corruption waiting for exactly that opportunity. His death was direct consequence of my 9 months of choosing silence over duty. I killed him, not the demon. Me. Through accumulated choices that had seemed individually justifiable, but had compounded into this moment where the only person who could have helped me was dead on my sanctum floor while the ship disintegrated around us. I had no time to process this properly. The ship was still accelerating through warp space, still being steered by my corrupted navigation decisions toward catastrophic failure. I stood from the deck plating, returned to my navigation throne despite the blood on my hands and the knowledge that I had just watched my only connection die, and I tried to regain control of our trajectory. The warp showed me chaos, no clear currents, no navigable routes, just turbulence in every direction, storm systems that would tear the ship apart if we entered them, and the entity maintaining its position beside us, 7 eyes watching my desperate attempts to find any path that led to survival. At hour 16, the Geller field failed. Not completely. Partial failure, fluctuating between 30 and 70% integrity, enough to allow warp energy to bleed into real space sections of the ship. Enough to allow daemons to manifest in corridors and chambers where crew had believed themselves safe. I heard the screaming start through my sanctum walls. I heard weapons fire. I heard the particular sounds that meant people were dying badly, while things that should not exist in reality demonstrated exactly why Geller fields were maintained at full capacity during warp transit. I could not help them. I could only navigate. I could only steer towards some destination that would allow emergency transition back to real space before total ship destruction. At hour 17, I found a gap in the warp storms. A narrow channel where the currents ran smooth enough that we might survive emergency transition. I angled the ship toward it, accepting that the course would put severe stress on already damaged systems, accepting that we would likely lose crew during the transition, accepting that this was the least catastrophic option available. The entity moved to block the channel. Same pattern, same positioning. It manifested directly in the path I needed to navigate through. 7 eyes watching me realized that it would not allow escape. It had spent 9 months setting up this moment. It would not permit me to avoid the finale. I had one option remaining. I stopped trying to avoid it. I stopped trying to navigate around it or through alternative routes. I aimed the ship directly at the entity and I pushed maximum acceleration. If it would not move, I would go through it. The ship responded with immediate systems overload. Every warning indicator activated simultaneously. Plasma drives exceeded safe operational limits. Structural integrity dropped below critical thresholds. The Geller field, already fluctuating, collapsed completely as I diverted power to propulsion. The entity's form expanded to fill my entire field of vision. 7 eyes multiplied into hundreds, into thousands, covering every surface of warp space ahead of us. Its appendages spread wide as though embracing our approach. The mouth opening appeared again, circular and lined with impossible geometries, and from that opening came the laughter that I had heard in my sanctum, amplified to frequency that resonated through ship hull and navigator consciousness simultaneously. We hit it at velocity that exceeded any safe warp transit speed. The collision was not physical. You cannot physically collide with warp entity that exists partially in dimensions humans cannot perceive. But our ship's reality space collided with its warp space, and the interaction produced catastrophic feedback that propagated through every system simultaneously. I saw the ship come apart in my third eye, saw compartments depressurize, saw hull sections separate, saw plasma drives detonate in chain reaction that consumed entire engineering decks, saw Geller field generators explode and release the accumulated warp energy they had been containing for 17 hours. Saw 12,000 crew members die in approximately 47 seconds. They did not all die the same way. Some were killed by decompression, some by fire, some by structural collapse, some by the demons that manifested freely once the Geller field was gone. Some by warp exposure that transformed them into things that were no longer human before they finished dying. I watched it all. My third eye remained open, remained processing input, remained functioning even as my sanctum walls ruptured, and the void beyond began pulling atmosphere out into the warp. I watched the ship die, and I watched the crew die, and I understood that this was my fault, my direct consequence, my responsibility. Captain Varys died on the bridge when a support beam collapsed across his position. I saw him trapped beneath metal that crushed his chest, saw him continue giving orders to crew who could not help him, saw him maintain command until his consciousness failed. He died doing his duty. I had killed him by failing mine. The crew I had shared meal rotations with for 9 years. The engineers who maintained my sanctum systems. The security personnel who protected Navigator territory, the medicae who treated my minor injuries, the thousands of individuals whose names I had never learned, but whose functions had supported mine. All dead, all consumed by the catastrophe I had created through 9 months of choosing silence. My sanctum reached 0 atmosphere, my lungs emptied into vacuum. My body should have died immediately from exposure. But my third eye remained open, remained processing warp space, and warp space does not follow physical laws that govern human survival. I continued perceiving even as my body failed. The entity appeared before me in the vacuum, no longer requiring reflection or peripheral vision. It was directly visible, fully manifested, its form shifting through configurations that my dying brain tried desperately to process. 7 eyes focused on me from distances that changed constantly. The appendages reached toward me, touching my face, my third eye specifically, pressing against the organ that gave me Navigator sight. Then it pushed inside, not physically, psychically. It invaded my consciousness completely, filling every space where thought occurred, accessing every memory I possessed, understanding me with perfect totality. It saw my childhood training. It saw my years of service. It saw my first glimpse of it in warp space. It saw every choice I had made to not report, every rationalization, every moment of fear that had prioritized my survival over proper protocol. It saw Hadrian's death and my responsibility for it. It saw the 12,000 crew deaths and my responsibility for them. It saw the complete moral architecture of my failure. And it found this hilarious. The laughter filled my consciousness until nothing else existed. Not malicious laughter, not even cruel laughter. Just pure entertainment at the perfect tragedy I had constructed. I had been Navigator trained to guide ships safely through hell. I had been given one job: maintain function, report problems, prioritize crew survival. And I had inverted every principle of my purpose because I was afraid of consequences that would have saved thousands of lives. The entity had not corrupted me. It had not forced my choices. It had simply watched me corrupt myself through accumulated fear and denial. And watching that process had been so entertaining that it had followed me for 9 months, patient and pleased, waiting for the inevitable conclusion. I was the entertainment. My failure was the purpose. And now that the failure was complete, now that I had killed everyone I was responsible for protecting, the entity was satisfied. It had watched the entire performance from beginning to end. It had seen every moment of my degradation, and it would remember me, not as individual, not as Tertius Seven Stellamar, but as particularly entertaining example of how humans destroyed themselves when given enough fear and time. I would become data point in whatever archive Daemons maintained, footnote in the catalogue of mortal suffering that fed the warp's endless hunger. My consciousness began fragmenting as my body finished dying. I felt myself dissolving into component thoughts, memories separating from personality, identity breaking down into raw data. The entity maintained its presence through this process, observing every stage, documenting my death with the same patient attention it had documented my navigation. Then something pulled me back. Not the entity. Something else. Some force that grabbed my fragmenting consciousness and compressed it back into coherent structure. I felt my awareness consolidate, felt my sense of self returning even though I had no body to contain it anymore. I opened my third eye, or whatever remained of it, and saw that I was no longer in my sanctum. I was drifting in warp space, bodiless, pure consciousness suspended in impossible dimensions. The ship was gone. Hadrian was gone. Everything except me and the entity had been consumed by the catastrophe. But I remained. Navigator consciousness, trained specifically to perceive warp space, robust enough to survive brief exposure, even without physical form. I was not dead. I was transformed into something else. Something that existed in the warp directly, without need for flesh or ship or protection. The entity drifted beside me, seven eyes watching, waiting. I understood what had happened. It had not just watched me fail. It had arranged for me to survive the failure. It had pulled me back from complete dissolution. It had preserved my consciousness specifically so that I would experience what came next. This was not the finale. This was intermission. Time does not function properly in the warp. I cannot tell you how long I drifted there. Hours or years or centuries, all equally valid descriptions of duration that had no relationship to linear progression. I existed in eternal present, consciousness without anchor, awareness without purpose. The entity remained beside me, always the same distance, always watching, never speaking, never interacting, never doing anything except observing my existence with patient attention. I tried to disperse, tried to allow my consciousness to fragment and dissolve into the warp. This would have been preferable to eternal observation, but whatever the entity had done to preserve me also prevented me from choosing dissolution. I was maintained as coherent consciousness through force that I could not resist or understand. I tried to communicate, tried to ask it what it wanted, why it had preserved me, what purpose this served. But I had no voice. I had no mechanism for producing communication. I could only perceive and be perceived. I was pure observation, trapped in mutual observation with something that found my existence entertaining. I counted to maintain sanity, counted warp current fluctuations, counted the times the entity's eyes multiplied and consolidated, counted the intervals between its movements when it would drift briefly away before returning to observation distance. I reached counts in the millions before I lost track and had to begin again. I replayed memories, reviewed my entire life in precise detail, examining every decision, every choice, every moment where I had prioritized incorrectly. This was productive initially. It helped me understand the exact architecture of my failure. But after reviewing my memories hundreds of times, they began to lose coherence. Details changed. Events I remembered clearly became uncertain. I could no longer distinguish between actual memory and memory of memory degraded through infinite replay. I existed alone with my thoughts and the entity that watched me think them. This was the isolation sequence. This was consciousness without input, awareness without external stimuli, existence reduced to pure internal processing. And what I learned during this period was that consciousness requires external input to remain stable. Without new data, without change, without anything except recursive self-examination, personality begins to decay. I forgot my designation. Tertius 7 Stellamar became abstract identifier that I knew I should remember, but could not access reliably. I forgot my house affiliation. Stellamar became word without attached significance. I forgot my training, my service history, my purpose as navigator. What remained was the memory of my failure. That stayed clear. That maintained perfect fidelity across whatever duration I spent drifting. I remembered watching Hadrian die. I remembered watching 12,000 crew die. I remembered understanding that this was my fault, my direct consequence, my responsibility. The entity preserved those memories specifically. When other memories degraded, those remained sharp. It was curating my consciousness, maintaining the specific awareness of my guilt while allowing everything else to corrode. This was the purpose, not just watching me fail, making me exist in eternal recognition of that failure, making me carry the weight of 12,000 deaths without anything else to distract from that weight. Pure guilt without personality, without identity, without any mitigating context. I was becoming memorial to my own catastrophe, living testament to what happens when navigators choose silence over duty. Then something changed. The warp currents shifted in pattern that suggested nearby ship transit. I felt the disturbance of reality space pushing through Imperium, felt the familiar signature of Gellerfield carving, safe passage through chaos. A ship was approaching our position. The entity moved. It drifted away from me toward the approaching vessel, its attention shifting for the first time since it had pulled me back from dissolution. I watched it go, watched seven eyes focus on new target, watched it demonstrate the same patient observation toward the ship that it had demonstrated toward me. Then it returned. It had not abandoned me for new entertainment. It had simply verified the ship's existence before returning to observation distance. I understood. The entity had been waiting for rescue vessel to arrive, waiting for someone to find the debris field from my catastrophic navigation failure, waiting for me to be recovered. 3 days later, or what passed for 3 days measured by the ship's transit time, a salvage team located my consciousness. I do not know how they detected me. Perhaps Navigator houses maintained search protocols for lost Navigator consciousness. Perhaps warp-specialized equipment could identify Navigator presence even without physical form. However they accomplished it, they found me and they extracted me from warp space and they returned me to some kind of containment. I woke in a medical facility on Terra, House Stellamar's private treatment chambers, where they processed damaged navigators. I had body again, though it was not my original body. This was clone flesh grown from my genetic material and implanted with my recovered consciousness. The process had required 6 months of careful integration to prevent rejection. I was informed that I had been declared dead following the Endless Devotion disaster. All crew lost. Ship destroyed. Catastrophic navigation failure attributed to unprecedented demon incursion during warp transit. House Stellamar had recovered my body, or the body that had become mine, from the debris field and had decided that my consciousness warranted preservation despite my failure. This was not mercy. This was asset recovery. Navigator consciousness was valuable genetic material that House Stellamar had invested significant resources developing. My failure had cost them a ship contract and reputation damage. But my continued existence could still provide value through study and potential return to service after appropriate reconditioning. They explained that I would undergo psychological evaluation and retraining. If I demonstrated adequate recovery, I might be reassigned to lower-risk navigation duties. If I did not recover, I would be maintained in suspension until House determined optimal disposition of my consciousness. I attempted to explain what had actually happened. Attempted to describe the entity that had been watching me, the 9 months of observation, the herding behavior during the final transit, the way it had preserved my consciousness specifically to maximize my suffering. The evaluators documented my testimony and noted it as demon corruption-induced delusion, requiring additional treatment. They did not believe me because believing me would require acknowledging that daemons could operate with that level of patience and planning. It was more comfortable to classify my experience as psychological break resulting from trauma of watching ship destruction. I was assigned to retraining protocols. 6 months of refresher courses on Navigator techniques, psychological conditioning to process the trauma, medical treatment to repair damage to my third eye that had occurred during extended warp exposure. During the first night in my new quarters, I saw it in the mirror. Same distance, same position. 7 eyes watching me. The appendage raised and waved greeting, as though we were old acquaintances resuming contact after brief separation. It had followed me. Through death, through resurrection, through 6 months of consciousness recovery, it had maintained observation across transformations that should have severed any connection. And now it was back in my life, patient and pleased, ready to watch the next phase of my existence. I did not report this to my evaluators. I had learned that reporting produced no beneficial outcome. They would classify it as persistent delusion, increase my treatment intensity, potentially determine that I was too damaged for continued service. Reporting changed nothing except increasing the consequences I faced. So I adapted. I learned to function while being observed constantly. I completed my retraining. I passed my psychological evaluations by learning to conceal the fact that I saw daemons in every reflective surface. I demonstrated adequate navigator capability and was cleared for return to service. House Stellamar assigned me to a short-range transport vessel operating in core Imperial space. Lowest possible risk rating. Routes so safe that even compromised navigators could complete them without catastrophic failure. This was probationary assignment, testing whether I could maintain basic function before risking me on more valuable vessels. I navigated adequately. No critical errors, no casualties. The entity watched me during every transit, maintaining its parallel position, but it did not interfere. It did not herd me into dangerous walk space. It simply observed as I performed basic navigation duties with mechanical precision. After 2 years of acceptable performance, I was reassigned to slightly higher risk routes, then higher still. Within 6 years, I was navigating merchant vessels through moderately dangerous warp regions. My performance classified as adequate, though not exceptional. The entity never left. It appeared in every reflection, every mirror, every glass surface I encountered. It watched me eat, watched me sleep, watched me navigate through warp space. It was present during every moment of my continued existence. Patient observer that never tired of monitoring me. I learned to function despite this. Learned to navigate while being observed. Learned to ignore the presence that could not be ignored. Learned to carry the weight of 12,000 deaths while performing the same duties that had killed them. I became exactly what the system required. A functional tool that had been broken and repaired and returned to service with slightly reduced specifications. Other crew members came and went. Captains, engineers, security personnel, astropaths. None of them stayed long enough to matter. None of them approached the significance that Hadrian had held. I maintained professional distance from all of them, performing my function without forming attachments that could be exploited or destroyed. Some of them reminded me of people I had known on the Endless Devotion. Similar speech patterns, similar mannerisms, similar ways of moving through the ship corridors. I would see them and momentarily remember the 12,000 I had killed, remember their faces before they died, remember my responsibility for their destruction. Then I would file the memory and continue forward, because continuing forward was the only available direction. 31 years after the Endless Devotion disaster, I was assigned to a new vessel named the Relentless Pursuit. The captain was young, newly promoted, carrying himself with confidence that suggested he had not yet learned how easily ships were destroyed. He requested meeting with me during the first week of my assignment. "Navigator Tertius," he said when I entered his ready chamber. "I reviewed your service history. You survived the Endless Devotion incident. 12,000 crew lost. You were the only survivor." "Correct." The official report classified it as unprecedented Daemon incursion. But I spoke with some veterans who served in that sector. They suggested alternative explanation. They suggested the Navigator made critical errors that led to Gellerfield failure and subsequent disaster. I said nothing. There was nothing to say that would improve this conversation. I need to know, the captain continued. Are you competent? Can you navigate my ship safely? Or are you damaged asset that House Stellamar returned to service because your genetic material was too valuable to waste? Most maintained polite fiction that navigators were mysterious but competent. This captain wanted truth. I can navigate your ship adequately, I said. My performance metrics are within acceptable range for navigator of my classification. I will not guarantee perfection. I will guarantee function sufficient to complete assigned transits. That is not reassuring answer. It is honest answer. If you require more reassurance than honesty provides, you should request my replacement. Then, I will observe your performance during first several transits. If you demonstrate competency, we will continue. If you demonstrate the errors that killed 12,000 crew on your previous vessel, I will report you to House Stellamar for immediate removal. Understood. I completed 5 transits under his observation. All successful. All within projected timeframes. All demonstrating adequate navigator capability. The captain stopped questioning my competence. But I noticed that he never fully trusted me. He maintained additional monitoring of my navigation decisions. He requested detailed explanations for course selections that other captains had accepted without question. He treated me as potential threat that required constant supervision. This was appropriate. I was potential threat. I had already killed 12,000 crew through accumulated navigation failures. The probability that I would eventually repeat similar catastrophe was non-zero. The entity watched these interactions with apparent interest. During moments when the captain questioned my decisions, I would see it in the bronze fixtures of the bridge, and its form would ripple with what might have been pleasure. It was entertained by the captain's suspicion. It was entertained by my careful navigation of professional relationship with someone who understood I was dangerous. It was still playing with me. Still watching me struggle to maintain function, while carrying the knowledge that I would likely fail again eventually. The endless devotion had not been finale. It had been first act. I was still performing for its entertainment, still demonstrating how humans tried to continue despite understanding their own inadequacy. I am currently Navigator Tertius 7 Stellamar, serving aboard the Relentless Pursuit, 67 years old, 49 years of active navigator service. I have completed approximately 800 walk transits since the Endless Devotion disaster. I have killed no additional crew through navigation failures. My performance metrics remain within acceptable range. The entity is still watching me. It appears in every reflection. It maintains the same observation distance. It has never stopped being present since the moment I first saw it 49 years ago. 7 eyes, patient and pleased, watching me perform basic navigator functions while carrying the weight of catastrophic failure. I understand now what Hadrian tried to tell me before he died. The entity is not individual Daemon. It is fragment of something larger, something that experiences time differently than humans. For it, 49 years of observation is not extended patience. It is momentary attention, brief focus on particularly entertaining element of the vast suffering it monitors continuously. I will never escape it. Even if I die again, even if my consciousness disperses completely this time, it will remember me. I have become part of its archive, permanent data point in its catalogue of mortal failure. It saw me choose silence over duty. It saw me kill 12,000 crew through accumulated cowardice. It saw me survive when I should have died, and return to service when I should have been terminated. And it found all of this sufficiently entertaining that it has maintained observation across half a century, never tiring, never leaving, never doing anything except watching me continue to exist, despite understanding exactly what I am. I am Navigator who failed catastrophically and killed everyone I was responsible for protecting. I am coward who prioritized self-preservation over proper protocol. I am broken tool that was repaired because my genetic material was too valuable to discard. I am living memorial to 12,000 deaths that occurred because I was afraid of consequences that would have been preferable to the consequences that occurred. I navigate because navigation is my function. I survive because survival is apparently my purpose now. I carry the weight of my failure across every transit, across every reflection where the entity watches me perform duties I have already demonstrated my inability to perform correctly. Hadrian was correct. I became complicit the moment I chose not to report. Everything after that was inevitable progression toward disaster. And the disaster continues, not in dramatic catastrophic failure, but in quiet ongoing existence where I perform adequately while understanding that adequacy is not redemption. The entity waves at me every morning when I look in the mirror. I wave back because acknowledging it is easier than pretending it is not there. This is our relationship now. Mutual observation, mutual recognition, mutual understanding that I am the entertainment and it is the audience, and this performance will continue until something finally breaks completely. I do not know if that will be me or the ship or the Imperium itself. I only know that when it happens, the entity will be watching, patient and pleased, recording every moment for whatever archive Daemons maintain. This is what the Imperium costs, not just the 12,000 who died on the endless devotion, but the continued existence of those who survived, carrying forward the knowledge of their failures, performing functions they have already demonstrated they cannot perform properly, maintained in service because their genetic material is valuable even when their consciousness is compromised. I am Navigator. I am failure. I am entertainment for something that exists beyond human comprehension. I am testimony to what happens when fear overrides duty and survival becomes more important than the thousands who depend on correct function. The entity is still watching. I am still navigating. This is all that remains.